There is a photograph taken in 1904 that has never been fully explained. It shows a building. Not a tent. Not a wooden frame draped in cloth. A building with columns that stretch 40 feet into the air, with archways carved in precise geometric relief, with walls that catch the light the way only solid mass can, heavy, deliberate, permanent. The caption beneath the photograph reads, "Temporary exhibition structure." That word. Temporary. It will follow us through everything that comes next. And by the time we are finished, you will understand why that word was chosen and what it was chosen to hide. The year is 1904. The city is St. Louis, Missouri. The occasion is the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, one of the largest World's Fairs ever assembled on American soil. Over 19 million people passed through its gates across 7 months. 19 million. In an era before commercial aviation, before the interstate highway system, before mass media could summon a crowd with the push of a button. They came by train, by horse, by foot. They came from Europe and Asia and the interior of a continent that was still, in many places, unmapped. They came to see the future. What they found was something else entirely. What they found were palaces. Let us be precise about what was built at St. Louis in 1904, because precision is the enemy of the narrative that has been constructed around these structures. The festival hall, the centerpiece of the fairgrounds, was modeled after St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Its dome measured 50 feet higher than the United States Capitol. It seated 3,600 people inside an interior that stretched, by contemporary measurement, to dimensions that would not be replicated in American civic architecture for decades. The Palace of Electricity. The Palace of Transportation. The Palace of Varied Industries. The Palace of Manufactures. Each one a colossal structure, not a mock-up, not a theatrical facade, but a building with load-bearing systems, vaulted ceilings, engineered foundations, internal electrical wiring, and climate considerations. The Palace of Agriculture covered more than 18 acres under a single roof. 18 acres. Under a single roof. And we are told this was built in less than 2 years, by a workforce with hand tools and horse-drawn equipment, as a temporary installation intended to be demolished before the snow fell. That is the official story. That is what the records say. But the records, as we will see, have a curious habit of saying only what they were arranged to say. To understand what was truly built at St. Louis, you must first understand what material was used to build it. The official record calls it staff. A composite mixture of plaster of Paris, cement, and fibrous material, sometimes burlap, sometimes hemp, applied over wooden or steel armatures. The story goes that the fair buildings were made of this substance because it was cheap, fast, and easy to demolish. The story goes that this is why nothing survives today. But here is what the official story does not explain. Staff, as described in the architectural literature of the period, was a decorative surfacing material. It was not a structural medium. It was used to create the appearance of stone cornices, friezes, decorative panels. It was not, by the technical standards of its time, capable of bearing the loads described in the exposition's own engineering documents. So what held up the dome of Festival Hall? What carried the span of 18 acres in the Palace of Agriculture? What kept those 40-foot columns standing through a Missouri summer of heavy exhibition traffic, through vibrations of heavy machinery, through the weight of crowds pressing against interior balconies? We are told, temporary materials. And yet, in the photographs, and there are thousands of them, these structures do not look like they are straining. They do not look provisional. They look settled. They look like they have been standing for a long time. That is not how temporary structures look. There is a man named Clarence Howard Blackall. He was one of the leading architects of his generation, a Boston-based designer responsible for several of that city's most enduring theaters. In 1905, 1 year after the St. Louis Exposition closed, Blackall published an essay in a professional architectural journal. The essay was a technical analysis of construction methods. In that essay, Blackall noted something that his contemporaries appeared to have quietly agreed not to discuss at length. He observed that certain exposition structures not only at St. Louis but at Chicago in 1893 and Buffalo in 1901 exhibited properties inconsistent with the materials that had been announced in their official construction records. He noted the precision of their ornamental detail. He noted the uniformity of their surface treatment. He noted their apparent resistance to weathering, even before any protective coating had been applied. Blackall did not use the word impossible. He was a professional. He used the word remarkable. But remarkable is a word architects use when they mean, I cannot explain this, and I am not sure I should try. Let us go back further. Because St. Louis in 1904 was not the beginning of this story. It was, in many ways, the continuation of a pattern that had been unfolding for over a decade, a pattern centered on a series of World's Fairs, each one appearing in a major American city, each one erecting enormous neoclassical cities within cities, each one announcing that everything would be demolished when the fair was over. Chicago, 1893. The World's Columbian Exposition. 200 buildings on 600 acres along the Lake Michigan shoreline. The centerpiece was a complex so architecturally unified, so geometrically precise in its urban planning, and so overwhelming in its scale that visitors, many of them educated, well-traveled people, described it in terms that were almost religious. They called it the White City. They wrote home in letters that survive in archives across the country, and those letters use words like ancient, eternal, already there when we arrived. That last phrase is strange. Already there when we arrived. It appears in multiple letters, independently, from people who did not know each other. What does it mean to look at a newly constructed building and feel that it was already there? It means the building does not look new. The official story of the White City says it was constructed in approximately 2 years, from 1891 to 1893, by an army of workers under the direction of Daniel Burnham and a team of American architects. It says the buildings were made of staff over steel frames. It says they were painted white, which is where the name came from. After the fair closed in October 1893, fire swept through portions of the fairgrounds. Additional structures were demolished. By 1894, most of the White City was gone. That is what the record says. But here is what the record cannot erase. Before the demolition, before the fires, the city of Chicago absorbed the building technology of the White City into its urban infrastructure almost immediately. The architects who designed the exposition went on to build the permanent institutions of the American city: the post offices, the train stations, the libraries, the federal courthouses, the universities in the exact same style, at the exact same scale, using the exact same vocabulary of columns, arches, domes, and neoclassical proportion. This is not coincidence. This is a direct line. But here is the question that line raises: if the White City was the origin of this architectural movement, if it was the laboratory where this new American civic style was invented and first demonstrated, then why does the White City look older than the cities it supposedly inspired? Why do the buildings of the 1893 fair look more ancient, more worn, more heavy with accumulated time than the federal buildings of 1895 or 1900 that were allegedly built in their image? You may be thinking, photographs can be deceiving. Techniques of the period produced high-contrast images that aged everything. Black and white removes our ability to judge surface quality. The eye compensates. These are fair objections. So let us move from photographs to physical evidence. Let us talk about what was found when they started to demolish these buildings. In 1894, workers began tearing down the remaining structures of the Chicago Fair. In St. Louis, demolition crews began their work in late 1904 and into 1905. Contemporary accounts from both sites, accounts from workers, from journalists who accompanied them, from site managers writing internal reports, describe something that created, at the time, a minor but notable controversy. The demolition was harder than expected. Significantly harder. In Chicago, a foreman named Edward Whittaker, whose name appears in several contemporary labor accounts, reportedly told a journalist from the Chicago Tribune that the staff material was not behaving the way staff material was supposed to behave. He said, and this was published in a brief item that has largely been forgotten, "It breaks wrong. Stone breaks in one way. Plaster breaks in another. This breaks in a third way I have not seen before. It breaks in a third way I have not seen before." That sentence was printed once and never followed up. In St. Louis, a similar observation appeared in a contractor's internal memo, later archived and partially digitized by a local historical society. The memo noted that certain wall sections required pneumatic tools that were not standard for demolition of plaster or composite materials, and that the rubble from these sections was unusually dense, with fragments that did not crumble but instead fractured cleanly, more consistent with the behavior of cured hydraulic cement or compressed mineral composite than with staff as conventionally prepared. Cured hydraulic cement. Compressed mineral composite. These are not descriptions of temporary materials. These are descriptions of construction substances designed to last. Here we must ask the question that the official record does not ask. Who built these buildings? The standard answer: American contractors, working under famous architects, with immigrant labor, in a compressed timeline, using industrial-era production techniques. That answer sounds plausible. It is designed to sound plausible. But let us examine the labor mathematics. The St. Louis Exposition required, by the estimate of its own published records, approximately 15 million square feet of constructed interior space. The official construction period began in earnest in early 1902 and ended in time for the April 1904 opening, approximately 24 months of active building. 15 million square feet in 24 months. Even using the most generous estimates of what a coordinated industrial-era workforce could achieve, accounting for prefabrication, for multi-shift operations, for the most advanced machinery then available, the numbers do not resolve cleanly. They hover at the edge of what was possible. They require every variable to go perfectly. Every delivery on time. Every weather window exploited. Every worker performing at maximum efficiency for every working day of every month for 2 years. In practice, that is not how construction works. Not in 1902. Not now. What we do know is this: no one who was present during construction left a detailed account of how the most complex architectural features were created. There are accounts of grading, of electrical installation, of landscape work. There are payroll records and material delivery logs. But the specific technical process by which 40-foot precision columns were manufactured, transported, positioned, and finished for dozens of buildings simultaneously is not clearly documented anywhere in the public record. That absence is not an accident. Let us introduce another layer. The architects of these expositions, the men who are credited with designing these cities within cities, came, in almost every case, from the same small network of East Coast firms. They trained under the same European influences. They were members of the same professional associations. Many of them knew each other personally, trained together, or worked for each other at various points. And when they spoke publicly about the fairs in interviews, in lectures, in published essays, they used language that, when examined closely, seems carefully managed. Daniel Burnham, the director of works for the 1893 Chicago Fair, was a gifted self-promoter. He wrote well. He gave memorable speeches. He was eloquent about the vision behind the White City, the idea that American cities should aspire to the grandeur of ancient Rome, that civic beauty was a moral force. But Burnham was notably vague when asked about specific construction methods. He spoke in terms of inspiration, of coordination, of the power of shared ambition. He did not speak, in any recorded instance, about the specific technical processes by which the most complex structural elements were achieved. This is unusual. Architects, as a rule, love talking about how they built things. The technical challenge is part of the story they tell about themselves. Burnham did not tell that part of the story. Neither did the others. There is a term used in historical research, the dog that did not bark. It comes from a Sherlock Holmes story, but it has become a legitimate methodological tool. It refers to the evidence of an absence, the thing that should be in the record but isn't, the question that should have been asked but wasn't, the investigation that should have been opened but was quietly left closed. In the case of the American World's Fairs between 1893 and 1915, there are several dogs that did not bark. No major engineering journal of the period published a detailed technical analysis of how the fair buildings were actually constructed. Given the scale of these projects, given that they were, by any measure, among the largest rapid construction efforts in American history, this is extraordinary. Engineering journals of that era were meticulous. They documented bridges, tunnels, skyscrapers, railway stations. They documented everything that was technically interesting. They did not document the fairs. No university architecture program produced, in the years immediately following these expositions, a scholarly study of their construction techniques. The fairs were studied extensively for their urban planning implications, their influence on civic design, their social and cultural effects. The how of their construction was not examined. Not by journalists. Not by engineers. Not by academics. The technical record simply stops. Now let us approach this from a different direction. Let us look at what happened to American cities in the decades immediately following the Great Fairs. Between 1895 and 1930, the United States undertook one of the most concentrated periods of civic construction in its history. Post offices, courthouses, train stations, libraries, university buildings, state capitals, city halls, hundreds of them, in cities across the country, built in the neoclassical style that the fairs had supposedly invented. These buildings are still standing. Many of them are still in daily use. Walk into Union Station in Washington, which opened in 1907. Walk into the New York Public Library, which opened in 1911. Walk into the old Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco, built in 1924. These are not fragile buildings. They are not buildings that show their age the way early 20th century structures typically do. They are, in many cases, in better condition than buildings constructed 30 or 40 years later with nominally superior materials. Now ask yourself, when was the knowledge to build these structures acquired? The official answer is, at the fairs. The fairs were the training ground. The fairs were where American architects and contractors learned to build at this scale, in this style, with this degree of precision. But if the fairs were the training ground, if the fair buildings were the experimental first attempts, then why do the permanent buildings that followed them not surpass them in quality? When human beings learn to do something, they improve with practice. First attempts are rougher than later ones. Prototypes are superseded by refined versions. The permanent civic buildings of early 20th century America did not surpass the fair buildings. In many cases, contemporary observers and some modern structural engineers who have examined the records argue that the permanent buildings do not match the fair buildings in certain measures of technical execution. If the fairs were the experiment produced better results than the finished product. That is not how experiments work. Unless the fairs were not the experiment. Unless the fairs were something else entirely. Consider a different framework. Not the one we have been given, in which ambitious American architects invented a new civic style from scratch and demonstrated it at a series of grand expositions. But a different one. What if these buildings were not constructed in the 2 years before each fair opened? What if they were already there? What if the men credited with building them were, in fact, documenting and exhibiting structures that already existed, structures whose origins had been obscured, whose previous occupants had been removed from the record, and whose continued existence after the fairs would have raised questions that no one in a position of institutional power wanted asked? This is not a comfortable framework. It requires us to accept that something was hidden deliberately, systematically, at scale. It requires us to believe that a significant historical falsification occurred, not once but repeatedly, in multiple cities, across multiple decades, involving multiple institutions. But let us follow the evidence and see where it leads. There is a researcher named David Sherrill, not widely known, not affiliated with a major university, who spent several years in the early 2000s examining county land records, municipal survey documents, and original exposition contracts in St. Louis, Chicago, and San Francisco. Sherrill was specifically looking for documentation of site preparation, the grading, clearing, and foundation work that would have been required to build on previously undeveloped land. What he found, and what he published in a small journal before the work was largely ignored, was this. In Chicago, the land designated for the 1893 fair, the Jackson Park site on the lakeshore, had been surveyed 3 times in the decade before the fair was announced. 2 of those surveys described the site as marshy, unstable, and unsuitable for heavy construction without substantial remediation. The 3rd survey, conducted in 1891, year before construction was announced, described the site as already partially improved, with what the surveyor noted as evidence of prior grading and, in one section, subsurface masonry of unclear origin. Subsurface masonry of unclear origin. That phrase appeared in a single surveyor's report. It was not followed up. It did not appear in any subsequent official document. The surveyor's name was James Porterfield. He filed his report with the Cook County Land Office in November 1890. 3 months later, he retired from surveying. He was 41 years old. In St. Louis, a similar anomaly appears in the pre-construction record. The site of the 1904 Exposition Forest Park and its surrounding areas had served as the location for a smaller civic event in the 1870s. When exposition planners began their site assessment in 1901, they commissioned a geological survey of the ground conditions. That survey has never been fully published. A partial summary was included in the exposition's official planning report, noting that ground conditions were found to be suitable for construction. But the full geological survey, which would have included detailed mapping of subsurface conditions, soil composition, and any pre-existing structural elements, was classified as an internal planning document and archived separately from the public record. That archive was partially damaged in a facility fire in 1947. The surviving portions are held by a private historical trust in St. Louis. Requests for full access have been, in the recorded cases of researchers who have tried, consistently declined on grounds of ongoing preservation work. The preservation work has been ongoing for over 30 years. We need to speak about the demolitions more carefully. Because the demolitions are, in many ways, the most important part of this story. If you wanted to erase the evidence that large, permanent, sophisticated structures had existed on a given site before a fair was held, the most effective method would not be to deny that the structures existed. The most effective method would be to make the structures yourself, to claim them as your own construction, and then to destroy them publicly, on a schedule, as a demonstration of their impermanence. If you demolish something, you control the narrative of its destruction. You control what is preserved and what is not. You control the photographs, the accounts, the material record. And critically, if you demolish something, you prevent anyone from examining it closely. The fires that swept through the Chicago Fairgrounds in 1894 were, in the official record, accidental. Some were attributed to vagrants taking shelter in the abandoned buildings. Some were attributed to electrical faults. The fires spread quickly and destroyed substantial portions of the remaining structures before they could be systematically examined or documented. The fires began approximately 6 months after the fair closed. 6 months is enough time to decide what questions you do not want asked. There is a man whose name appears only twice in the primary sources related to the 1893 Chicago fire, but whose appearance in both instances is striking. His name is recorded, in both cases, as J. Morrow. No first name in full. No institutional affiliation. In one account from a Chicago Tribune item dated March 1894, Morrow is described as having been present at the Jackson Park site the night the first fire broke out. He is quoted as saying, without further context, "This was always the plan." The reporter did not ask what plan Morrow meant. The Tribune did not follow up. J. Morrow does not appear in any other document related to the Chicago Exposition, the City of Chicago, or in the searches that have been conducted any other public record of that period. He said what he said. And then he vanished. This was always the plan. Let us talk about the children. One of the most documented responses to the Great American World's Fairs was the effect on children who attended them. Diaries, letters, and later memoirs from people who visited these fairs as young children return, with striking consistency, to a particular emotional experience. Not wonder at the new. Not excitement at the future. Memory. Recognition. Multiple accounts describe children asking their parents why the buildings looked like they had been there for a long time. Multiple accounts describe a feeling of familiarity that the parents, in their written responses, found inexplicable, dismissing it as imagination, as the child's tendency to pattern match from picture books or story illustrations. But the pattern recurs too often to dismiss. A woman named Harriet Gould, writing her memoirs in the 1940s, described visiting the St. Louis Exposition as a girl of 8 with her father. She wrote, "I remember asking my father who had lived there before us. He laughed and told me no one had lived there, it was all made for the fair. But I was certain I had interrupted something. That we were visitors to a place that had its own history, and we were not part of it. I was certain I had interrupted something." A child's perception. Easily dismissed. Unless that child perceived something that adults had been trained not to notice. Here is what we know about human perception and environmental cues. Children, before they have been taught to interpret their environment through inherited cultural narratives, often respond to physical and environmental signals with a directness that adults have learned to suppress. The sense of age in a structure, the particular quality of light in old stone, the resonance of sound in high ceilings, the smell of accumulated mineral time, these are things that human senses can detect below the level of conscious analysis. Adults at the fairs knew what they were supposed to see: a new construction, a temporary marvel, a demonstration of American ambition. Children had not yet learned that knowledge. And children, with striking frequency, saw something else. By 1915, the great era of American World's Fairs was effectively over. The Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco in 1915 was, in many ways, the last of the truly massive efforts, and it introduced a new element. Unlike its predecessors, the 1915 fair preserved one of its structures permanently. The Palace of Fine Arts, designed by architect Bernard Maybeck, was not demolished after the fair closed. It was maintained, and eventually, in the 1960s, fully rebuilt in concrete. The decision to preserve the Palace of Fine Arts was framed, publicly, as an aesthetic choice, a recognition that this particular building was too beautiful to lose. But Bernard Maybeck, in a letter written to a colleague in 1917, offered a different explanation for why he had advocated for the building's preservation. The letter, which is held in the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, states that Maybeck believed the Palace of Fine Arts occupied a site that had been significant long before the fair. He did not specify why he believed this. He did not provide evidence. He simply wrote that he felt the site deserved a permanent marker, that destroying the building entirely would be, in his words, an erasure too complete. An erasure too complete. Maybeck was not a man given to mysticism. He was a rigorous, technically accomplished architect with a distinguished career. He chose his words carefully. An erasure too complete suggests that some erasure had already occurred. It suggests that the building's preservation was, at least in part, a gesture towards something that had already been lost. What had been lost? What was already erased before the fair began? We have traveled a significant distance from that photograph of a temporary building with 40-foot columns. But the distance has been deliberate, because what we are examining is not a single anomaly. It is a system. It is a pattern that repeats across cities, across decades, across institutions. The pattern is this. Large, sophisticated, neoclassical structures appear at World's Fairs. They are attributed to rapid construction by American firms using composite materials. They are exhibited for months to millions of visitors. Then they are demolished, usually by fire, sometimes by organized demolition, before any independent technical examination can be completed. The architects credited with building them do not leave detailed technical records. The site surveys that preceded construction are incomplete, classified, or damaged. And the civilization that these fairs helped inspire, the American civic architecture of the early 20th century, cannot fully account for where the knowledge came from. This pattern could have multiple explanations. Negligent record-keeping. The general disorganization of a young nation managing enormous projects. The destruction of documents by fire and time. The tendency of builders to treat proprietary knowledge as trade secrets. All of these explanations have merit. All of them account for parts of the pattern. None of them account for all of it. And none of them explain the demolition fires. None of them explain the absent surveyor reports. None of them explain why professional journals did not document the most technically impressive rapid construction projects in American history. None of them explain J. Morrow and his statement that was never followed up. None of them explain the children who felt they had interrupted something. There is one more thing. In 1904, a civil engineer named Frederick Grayson was assigned to the post-exposition site assessment for the St. Louis Fairgrounds. His job was to evaluate the condition of the land after the fair structures had been removed, to assess the feasibility of returning the area to parkland or preparing it for new development. Grayson's final report, submitted in 1906, is a largely unremarkable document except for its appendix. In the appendix, Grayson noted that in several locations beneath the footprints of demolished exposition buildings, his team had encountered foundation elements that did not correspond to the documented construction records of those buildings. He noted, specifically, that in one location, the depth of engineered substructure exceeded by several feet what the fair's construction plans had specified. He noted that the material composition of this deeper substructure differed from the materials used in the fair buildings above it. He did not speculate about what this meant. He noted it, appended it, and submitted his report. The appendix was not included in the version of the report that was published and entered into the public record. It exists only in Grayson's original handwritten submission, which was archived in a state records facility and has been examined by, at most, a handful of researchers in the century since. Grayson himself continued working as a civil engineer for another 20 years. He never publicly discussed the appendix. He never published a separate account of what he found. He was a professional man in a professional era. He understood the limits of what a professional man was permitted to say. So he said nothing. And the foundation, whatever it was, whatever it rested on, whatever it had supported before anyone declared it temporary, remained beneath the earth, where it remains today. The buildings of 1904 were called temporary. The records that could explain them were classified, damaged, or simply never written. The men who might have spoken chose silence. And beneath the ground where those palaces stood, beneath Forest Park in St. Louis, beneath Jackson Park in Chicago, beneath the sites of a dozen other great expositions, there are things that have not been examined, foundations that exceed their stated specifications, layers of construction that do not correspond to what the official record says was built. We do not know what is down there. We do not know because we have never been permitted to ask the question loudly enough, persistently enough, or with the kind of institutional support that would require an answer. But the photographs remain. The demolition workers' accounts remain. Grayson's appendix remains. The children's letters remain. Bernard Maybeck's careful, loaded words remain. And they are telling us something. They are telling us that what we call the beginning was not the beginning. That what we call construction was, at least in some cases, something more like discovery. That the civilization we believe we built from scratch was, perhaps, built on foundations that were already their foundations that someone, at a particular moment in history, decided we were not meant to know about. The buildings are gone. But the ground remembers.